We're continuing our Moses with the People series today. I wanted to start today by talking about one of the strange things about being a pastor. Just a little bit of a look into my world. You might not, of course, being a pastor is completely normal. No, you probably aren't thinking that. It's sometimes strange. Sometimes it's strange to introduce yourself in a non-religious setting. So, Henry, what do you do? Okay, you're a banker. That's interesting. And Josh, what do you do? I'm a pastor. What? It's usually like they didn't hear me or something was a little bit confusing. But what? Oh, I'm a pastor. Like, of a church? Yeah, I'm a pastor of a church. It's a church called Elm City Vineyard. We meet downtown. Where's that? A few of us have had a lot of experiences thinking about where our church is. So where's that? It's downtown. So what's it called again? Elm City Vineyard? Yeah. So you pastor a winery? What's going on? So I often just have some interesting conversations with people as I share about what I do. I've gotten into conversations about how my job is kind of like a social worker. I've talked about the relational dynamics of leading people. They've been very interested in that kind of like social component of the job. Other times people focus in on like the executive aspects. It's like kind of running a business, like you kind of have to lead these structures, and I talk to them about that. One time I explained what the Vineyard was to the husband of a local school principal in town at a dinner party. And he was just fascinated actually by the Vineyard. And he kept like interrupting his wife's conversation to be like, hey, did you hear about this? Like the Vineyard, oh yeah, like this. I was like, are we talking to your wife? It was very confusing. It was very weird. But besides that guy, most people aren't like that interested or definitely not as fascinated as he was. And usually they just connect my job to the thing they know best, whether it's a communicator, like an executive leader, a community organizer, a social worker. They're kind of like, so your job is like that, like this thing that I know, this thing that I'm familiar with. I'm like, well, yeah, I guess. And maybe that's because the God part of my job is strange. People usually don't focus on that part, this part about God. So why not focus on some other elements that make it a bit more normal, a bit more understandable, a bit more comfortable? And I think that's because believing in an invisible God who's moved throughout history and is still relevant today, it's a bit weird. It's a bit strange to do that. God, as it turns out, isn't the most normal person there is. I think it's strange to think that we can connect with God. It's strange to think we can help one another do that. That's an odd thing. And I actually think that's completely okay to think. And some of you are probably thinking that right now. And others of you might not think that, but it might be because you don't want to be strange. Well, if you haven't noticed, and if you've been part of this series with us, you know that the stories that we've been telling, they're a little strange. The stories of Moses. For all of its Hollywood flair, it's actually, I think, had like some kind of performance at Trinity Church this Friday. So still happening. The movies are still going. For all of its Hollywoodness, it's still very abnormal. It's a very abnormal story, the story of Moses. But once we find a way to receive the strangeness, I think it's pretty powerful. And I hope today is the same. We're going to have some strange stories, but I hope that we have a powerful experience together. And as we've been looking at Moses, we've become aware that Moses wasn't chosen for his qualifications. If you were there early with us in the first talk, you know that he killed a man and then he ran away because he was passionate about injustice. That was his response. He was passionate about injustice, decided to kill someone, and then he ran away. He wasn't chosen because of like the honor of that. He was actually chosen because of the unrefined gifts that were in him, his passion for the people. We've even learned that the people themselves might not actually be people who really know God that well. These people have been oppressed, they've been traumatized, and they find God's freedom actually unusual. So like they've been freed, and they're kind of like, wait, why did God do this? We kind of want to be back in Egypt. It's strange. They even resist God freeing them. They doubt before their rescue, and they grumble after it. These are the people of God. Do these people look like us? They've been oppressed, but now they're under a different kind of bondage. These people have been freed, yet they still need freeing. And as people at ECV, I think we can relate in some ways. We can relate to being timid like Moses when receiving a call, but also having some kind of passion for God to move in our lives, to move in our communities. And some of us can relate to people who have experienced something of God's power, but still find a way to complain about some things, maybe on a regular basis, maybe some specific complaints we have against God. We can relate to being stuck in the wilderness, waiting for God's next move for our lives, just wondering, when is God going to speak again? When is he going to move again? Is he even there? This is a strange story, the story of Moses, but I think we can adopt this story as our own and receive an invitation from God today. I want to pray for us as we begin to help us do that together. God, I thank you for this story, and I thank you for your presence. God, I thank you that even though you are strange and following you is strange, we can still meet you, that you have made a way for that to happen. God, I pray that that would happen here today. As I speak, as we are together, would you just bless us all and give us the space and the time to consider you and what you're saying to us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Some of you all are familiar with a certain structure in television shows or movies. It's the scene, like the beginning scene, where it's like really amazing, you're really like tracking, and all of a sudden it stops. And then it says something like this, 72 hours earlier. And you realize what you saw wasn't actually the beginning of the movie. In fact, it was the end. Well, I don't think I've ever done a sermon like this, but I want to start there today. And it's actually close to 72 hours, I think. I could be wrong. So we're going to start with the end. Then the people stood at a distance, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. That's where we're going to end today, but it's also where we're going to begin. It's like a crazy verse, right? And kind of an amazing one. I saw this, I was like, how can I not start with this? Then the people stood at a distance, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. That's the end. So we'll get there. Hopefully I won't be too annoying like that movie or TV show. It's like, but that's the best part. When are we going to get back there? We'll get there. We have some questions from this scene. Why are the people distancing themselves from God? And why is Moses still comfortable drawing near to a God who is enveloped in thick darkness? This is the story of what happens when God nudges us, when he moves us, either from a place of no faith, little faith, or constant faith, to simply say, I'm here, and I'm inviting you to know me deeper. This introduction, this God that is somehow in this thick darkness, isn't based on anything we're asking God to do. And in this part of the story, it's not about plagues. It's not about parting the Red Sea. There's no miraculous provision. It's just a meeting of a holy God and us, people who are other than God. That's all that's happening here. This meeting is thick with the presence. Oh no, I think this doesn't have a font on it, so bear with me. With the present, there's an S. You can see the tip, I promise. This meeting is thick with the presence and awareness of God. And it's dark, but it's not dark in a way that's negative, but it's simply the darkness of a room. It can be intimidating, right? But it's not inherently intimidating. It can reveal something that is unknown to us. So this thick darkness, again, don't think it's negative, but it's powerful, and it's present in this part of the story. This doesn't seem like the place to start a covenant, to start a relationship, but God seems to use these times of thick darkness to form us as his people. God didn't make a covenant in the midst of freeing the Israelites from the Egyptians. He didn't just say, as he was parting that Red Sea, like, will you be my people forever? Didn't do that. He just kind of let the moment happen. But it was this moment, Matt called it a time after the fireworks. That's the time where God deliberately called his people to see him, to recognize him, to acknowledge him. The question is, can we bear relating to this kind of God? A God who would wait for the wilderness to pass, for the desert to pass, and then just kind of show up in this thick darkness. Can we bear that kind of relating to God and the strangeness that is there? I think this kind of relating makes two facts very central to us. It's that God is very different than us, And I think, we'll just have to bear with it. And I think part of that is that God is holy, that God's actually set apart, that he's different. And that God has a way we ought to live. And the flip side there is that we actually make mistakes. We sin. So there's something about this thick darkness, this cloud, that reveals something to the people, that they're different from God, that God is holy, and you'll see the part about God having a way we ought to live, that we sin, that we make mistakes. We can relate very differently to these things as people. And there are two fundamental truths that are very hard to face, that we are not God and that we aren't perfect, that we make mistakes, that we make a lot of them. Here's more of the story. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, for you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." The setting here is that they're at Mount Sinai. Their kind of desert journey isn't over exactly, but they're taking this rest, this break in the mountain. And once again, God calls Moses up and has this time of conversation with him. And this whole passage right now can seem a little bit strange. Why would God just speak to Moses here? Well, I think there's a way that Moses is hearing this actually really good news, a news about a covenant. That God desires to use the people. He treasures the people simply because God rescued them. These are the people of God. Despite their ignorance, their disobedience, their grumbling, as Matt mentioned last week, there was a lot of grumbling last week. Even with all of that happening, God invites them to a covenant. Well, what's that going to look like? How's it going to start? What does it mean to have a covenant with God? What's the first thing God's going to do? This is God's choice in Exodus. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after." God's like, I'm going to make an appearance. It's going to be in a cloud, like a dense cloud. I want the people to see that. I want them to see me. It's kind of a strange choice. I guess a burning bush is also strange, but maybe we just know more about a burning bush and have seen pictures of it, so we'd all want to see one. Maybe we wouldn't. But there's something weird about God's just going to show up in a cloud, to people. That's what God's deciding to do. But he also has some more instructions. When Moses had told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and prepare for the third day, because on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled." Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. At the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak and God would answer him in thunder. When the Lord descended upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Again, pretty strange. You wonder why God did this. Who's God's PR agent? It would be a good idea just to have this cloud and Moses speaks and there's thunder happening. That's the way they're dialoguing back and forth. If you're a person, what are you thinking? What are you feeling here? I think this whole passage seems like bad news to us. Why do the people need to consecrate themselves? Why do they need to prepare to meet God? Something about this might rub us the wrong way. It flies in the face of some common assumptions we might have about a relational God. Come as you are, just make sure to wash the jeans. Jesus is my homeboy, question mark. I know I'm skipping to Jesus. We'll get back to Jesus in a second. But again, relational. And then of course we've got the buddy Jesus here. what happens? Like, can I still relate to Jesus in this way? Can I still relate to God in this way? Why is there this distance that God seems to be building between the people? It's a cloud, there's thunder, Moses is mediating. Why is this here? I think one way of asking this is, why holiness? Why might we want a God to be holy other than us? I think if we look at the Israelites, this might be an easier answer for them. They were entangled in a world of gods that surrounded them in Egypt. Not only did this include some kind of supernatural things, we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, the secret arts that were replicated as Moses did miracles, and then these magicians of Egypt did the same ones. But also there's other gods, the riches of Egypt, the safety that they felt there compared to the wilderness, the inevitability of their enslavement. There were these things that kind of acted as gods for them, ways they saw themselves, being comfortable in slavery, not wanting to leave, telling Moses time and time again, are you really sure about this freedom plan? Like, do you really want us to go? We're kind of okay here. These are gods that actually looked a lot like them and their fears. It looked a lot like what they made big, what was enforced on their lives. But the God that rescued them was different. He was 100% free and was invested in them without being at all like them. See the catch there? He was 100% free, could do anything, yet he was invested in them without being like them. I think for us, we can fall into a similar trap as the Israelites. We can become entangled in a world where our gods resemble our broken and disordered desires. We look to comfort, we idolize pleasure, we long for recognition. Those desires and the pursuits they lead us to are not free. They actually come at a cost. And they are not other than us. We actually end up making gods in the image of our own broken desires. What we long for, what we pursue, actually looks a lot like us. And we notice that the us it looks like is actually pretty ugly. We need to be shaken up by a holy God who is free to do anything, yet he chooses to reveal himself to us. That God could do anything in the world because he's actually free, but he chooses to pursue us. If we think that's a right we have, a right to know God as we are, I think our faith becomes less wondrous. Our worship of God becomes less honest, and our obedience becomes selective and tainted by our own interest. Oh man, God. We make God into God, one of many. Yes. Instead of being, this one's going to be crazy, I'm not even going to do it. No, I'll do it, just for you. Instead of making it a bigger God. The big G, we can say. But actually, really, we make this big God into something that's a lot smaller. And it's not just that there's one anymore, that there's a lot. That's why a lot of times we're confused. Because we're turning in different directions, not in one direction of seeking God, but actually seeking these things that we make gods of our lives. It's confusing, it's tiresome, and at the end of the day, it's slavery. It's not the same that the Egyptians put the Israelites in, but it's still a kind of slavery. We push God away in favor for our greater desires, and then we ask God to simply give us those greater desires if we ask anything of God at all. We want the freedom from Egypt, we want bitter water turned sweet, we want fast food in the desert. We think that's all we need. But God is holy, and he wants his people to see him. He wants them to know the possibilities of a covenant, of a relationship. If this God who is other is still invested in us, then we need to be invested in this God being strange. Actually, God being strange might be what saves us, right? It might be what actually makes a different story happen. Because he's strange enough to still pursue us despite our tendency to wander, to get lost, to abandon God and his purposes. Around a year ago, I had a weird season in my life where I feel like God removed my words. I probably still preach in that time, definitely still talk to you all and to Tina, so it's not like I actually couldn't speak. But I felt like I couldn't talk to God in a certain way I was used to. I was growing stressed. I had some critical decisions I was facing with Tina as we were trying to make plans as a family, thinking about where we'd be in the long term. Tina and I were disagreeing more than we usually did, and I really needed direction. I really needed to be guided by God for this particular situation. And at that point, I developed a habit of writing down my prayers and writing down what I felt like was God's response to them. That had really guided me in my life. It had really helped me out. And then all of a sudden, this really important season, when I really needed words from God, when I really needed direction from Him, clear instructions, I felt like the words were gone. Like there weren't any words anymore. I felt silenced. I felt muffled. And I was a bit miffed at God. Why would God make it harder for me to speak to Him? Isn't He invested in relationship? I needed to hear things from Him. Why would He be silent at this time? But if I was honest, I knew that there wasn't just complete silence, like the absence of words or impressions I was feeling. I felt a presence, and it was a heaviness, and it was a similar feeling to the kind of feeling you feel when someone's behind you, but you don't see them, but you just feel like there's someone behind you. Have you felt that before? It's like there's someone there. And I tried to use words to engage with kind of that presence of God, and it still didn't work. I was trying like, God, I feel you might be here doing something. Can I just speak to you about this? It just didn't work. Finally, I shared I was having these experiences with my spiritual director. He said, have you just tried being silent? Have you just tried being silent with the silence and not asking questions, not using your words, not demanding an answer? No, I haven't done that. I guess not yet. I wanted words. I wanted conversation. I wanted God in the way that had grown comfortable to me. God, however, wanted something different. I think He wanted my emotions. He wanted my attention. Not just words, quick journaling, a practice that perhaps was growing a little too familiar. Perhaps was more of my words than God's. God wanted to go deeper with me. And as I gave into that, this silence and this space that God was forcing me to create, I saw God growing something in me. It was an awareness of His presence. Not a presence that needed words, but one that needed more of my full devotion. And when I dialed down and spent time in that silence, I actually became more at peace. To be honest, that didn't help on decision making in any way whatsoever. Like it actually just didn't. And if you kind of know what decision I'm talking about, it's kind of funny that it didn't have anything to do with it. Basically, I didn't need to make a decision at the end of the day. But that didn't, which is funny, it's God. I'm like, I need to make a decision. God's like, you don't, but you don't know that yet. But it actually did give me a lot of peace in a season where anxiety really threatened me, and it threatened my marriage, it threatened how I was doing in general. God gave me peace in that. God's otherness, His holiness, it's not meant to be completely understood by us. It's actually a very good thing that we don't completely understand God, that we don't completely understand Him. Yet, this holiness, this otherness remains a gift for us if we can receive it. Because it's strange, and because it probably will bother us, especially at first. But can we receive this gift that God's giving us? And as if things weren't already hard enough, already difficult enough with just like kind of this weird presence of God that isn't speaking or speaking through thunder, there's even more of a weird part of the story that involves God's covenant, the way that humans ought to relate to God and to one another. This is what we know as the Ten Commandments, the cornerstone of God's law. We might, because of the movies, think that it started with this tablet, but it actually just started with God speaking in this cloud. So it's not, we'll get to this next week, it's not actually intelligible in a way that's like, oh yeah, I can just see this on a tablet. It's actually just a voice from God in this kind of terrifying presentation, saying the following. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that it is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the Lord your God, of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. All happening with this kind of terrifying cloud. 3 commandments all about the otherness of God, his holiness, and our proper response to God, our proper response to him. God starts there, saying, this is who I am. Are you going to acknowledge me as who I am, not as anything else? And are you not going to acknowledge anything else like you would acknowledge me? Can we make that promise together? The rest is about our relationships to others, ways that we're actually called to be a set-apart people who worship a set-apart God. And I don't think these laws are actually about moral perfection. It's hard not to think they are when they're called the 10 Commandments or 10 Rules. But I think they're actually about creating a distinct people, about becoming a distinct kind of person who's been changed as a response to worshiping a living God, not another lesser God that we could create with our own imagination. When we worship the true God, I think these become marks of our lives. It's remembering the Sabbath day, keeping it holy, honoring your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. God tells them not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness against your neighbor, to not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. A set-apart God is giving us ways of being set apart in our relationships. So what's Moses' response? What's the people's response? You'll find some familiar language here. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. We're back where we started. Through this encounter, people actually distance themselves from God. They don't see the thick darkness as an invitation for relationship. They don't see the law as a help for their relationship with God or with one another. They are simply scared. Moses, more of you, but less of God. Moses, we need you. God, we want less of. We're actually afraid of him. Moses, on the other hand, is fine approaching this thick darkness of God. Why is that? Why is Moses somehow okay with this in a way that the other people aren't? I want us to look at a few things from Moses' life before turning how we can be people who see this otherness of God as an invitation as opposed to something that disqualifies us from relationship. And if you've been following this story with Moses as we've been doing the series, these will be familiar to you. I think there's 3 things that distinguish Moses from others given what he has experienced. And I'm just going to say them to you because they're all in that weird font. Moses has epically failed. It's just true. Moses had an epic failure in his life. And God still pursued him. God still actually sought him out when he was in the wilderness. And God decided to use him. I think through that, Moses has seen God's character. He's seen that God wasn't simply rescuing them out of Egypt to give them into this horrible experience. It's what the Israelites thought a lot. And he didn't simply take them to the desert to abandon them. Through his own story, Moses is aware of God's redemptive ways. The redemptive ways of God are part of Moses' story. He can't separate that. The only reason why he's in the desert, the only reason why he's out Mount Sinai, is because God reached into his story. And God put redemptive purposes in his life, saying, I know your past, but I'm actually going to make a different story possible with you. Because of that, Moses can't really see God's character as something other than what he knows it to be, a God who redeems. 2, and this is a very practical point. I didn't think about this until doing a close read of the text. But Moses already broke some of these commandments. Moses heard them. It's like, oh, well, I broke that one. I probably broke that one. Okay, I think I broke that one. Moses kind of realizes, yes, these are commandments from God, but I already broke these. And yet God is making him into the man that's leading people into a covenant. It's a weird point, but I think it's actually important. Again, the commandments aren't about moral perfection. They're about setting apart our lives and the things and people in them for God's purposes. It's just another way of acknowledging who God is. It's another way of acknowledging our relationship with him. I think thunder and lightning, of course, would have been scary, but it would have been frightening, I think, to be a person hearing this voice that says the mistakes you've actually made in your life. But it's more frightening if you think all of that's going to disqualify you from relationship with God, that you think this just means I can't be involved with who he is. Moses already knows his transgression, but he sought out relationship with God as a way to move forward. He went towards God in his brokenness, not away from him. And I don't think the people understand that yet. And lastly, again, kind of a practical point here, Moses is open to God being a bit strange. Moses' story has already experienced a strange God. Remember, he was the man that there was a burning bush, and he said, let me investigate that. I wanted to see more about this burning bush over here that led him into a conversation with God that ultimately gave into all these redemptive purposes happening. Because of what he's seen, he's not as frightened or weirded out by this invisible God who makes himself known. And in the end, I think this says it's all about relationship, our relationship with God. Either the one we have now, the one that we're considering, and that often includes a thick darkness, an awareness that God is completely other than us. Whether it's through God's strangeness, whether it's us serving other gods, we know that we are unlike the one who's freed us. Sometimes in painful ways, we realize that we're unlike this God. But the question in all of that is, can we still be people who are open, even in our unlikeness, to be with God? And maybe the thing that's most unlike us, most unlike God in all of this, is that he's still pursuing us in relationship. I think that's what makes the thick darkness even that much more annoying, that it seems to follow us, that it seems to be with us all the time. When we don't want to pray, or we're not sure if we want to believe in God anymore, if we're not sure he's good anymore, we feel this thick darkness, this presence that doesn't give up on us. I know I felt this time and time again, as I'm wondering, should I lean into this world that I could believe in, that's possible through God? Or should I just live my life as usual? And I felt a presence, something that's whispered and saying, stay on this course. We see time and time again in this story where God, he's befuddled, he's angry at the people's choice to distance themselves from him, but that it doesn't stop the story from continuing. God still invites these people to be the people of God. What do we do with a God like that? I think we actually approach God and approach the thick darkness with the covenant of God in hand. Ooh, yay. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. I think we keep this covenant, the covenant that God himself has spoken, in our hand. And we say that it's a gift, and we approach God with it. I think Moses really trusts this promise, that somehow his obedience and his relationship are connected to God's work of blessing the whole earth. And thankfully, his promise is not just the law, because that actually wouldn't be the best news. As Moses knows, he already broke that at the beginning of his journey, right? The promise instead is God himself. And specifically, we know it's God's redemptive work that we see in the world, God's redemptive work that we see in Jesus. At the end of the day, it's Jesus actually that gives us confidence to approach the thick darkness of God. The people saw God's cloud of glory, and they chose Moses as their priest. They chose Moses as their mediator. We know of God's thick darkness, the parts of God that seem inaccessible to us, that seem strange to us, that seem overwhelming to us. We know of God's law that can make us feel the same way, overwhelmed and maybe even condemned. And the question is, who will we choose as our priest? Who will we choose as the one we go with into this thick darkness that surrounds us? An ancient sermon in a different part of Scripture, the letter to Hebrews, exhorts us to choose Jesus, the one who walks in grace and truth. Even though Moses doesn't know Jesus at all, doesn't work time-wise, this seems to be somehow more of how Moses approaches God, how he sees God, as opposed to the people that are still being formed, that are still learning to know who God is. Somehow Moses seems to think that it is about relationship. And this is the exhortation we get from the letter to Hebrews. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet is without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. As I put up our reflection questions, I want to invite the worship team to come up. Again, I think in our lives we experience the thick darkness of God, and the first question is, where is that for you? Is it a particular area of your faith? Is it a particular area of struggle you've had? A place where you're trying to connect, but you just can't seem to connect with God? I think through Jesus we can approach that thick darkness and actually have confidence that God will meet us where we are. The second thing is, we've got to ask the question, are there any other gods that we need to give up in order to receive the invitation from the living God? Like, the invitation is already there, but sometimes we need to actually give up something to see it as a present invitation, because there's a block that we have in our own lives. And that's part of the ought-tos that we see in the Ten Commandments. They're things that block us from a relationship with God. And lastly, how is God calling you to live in his covenant? How is God calling you to actually embrace this offer of relationship? A relationship that goes deeper than sometimes we'd like it to go. A relationship that actually can speak to us, can minister to us, even when we're far off from God. We know that when we were far off from God, that Jesus came close to us. That's why we celebrate communion every week, because we celebrate Jesus making his way to us, coming close to us, not just in his ministry, in his life, but also in his death, in the sacrifice that he received. When we take the bread that represents his body and we dip it in the cup that represents his blood, we're actually celebrating, we're remembering this God who came close to us, even when sometimes we'd rather have him stand far off. So I want us, when we take communion today, to think about coming close to a God, coming close to this God, especially in these places where we can often try to distance ourselves from him, and to receive what he's doing in that space, in those hard spaces. So I want to pray for us as we close. God, I pray that you would be here, that you would pierce through the thick darkness that sometimes surrounds our relationship with you, that sometimes surrounds the thought of even having or beginning a relationship with you. We say that you are good, and we say, have your way, God, in us. We give you permission to speak to us, to interact with us. And we lean forward to hear from you more with confidence. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.